The alarm that woke Maya Kingston was not the kind of alarm one recognizes as such. It wasn't the piercing siren of an evacuation protocol, nor the deep thrum of a hull breach. It was a tone she had heard only once during her entire training at the Diplomatic Academy of London, a tone so rare that most cadets assumed it was just a relic from older simulators, a historical data point, a pedagogical curiosity. It was the call of universal silence, the emergency protocol that only triggered when the Nexus stopped speaking. Maya opened her eyes inside her quarters on Meridian Station, an orbital platform circling the gas giant Velshar almost 4,000 light-years from the Sun. The translucent walls of organic ceramic material that normally displayed a soft window to the planet's orange clouds now showed only static gray. There was no data connection. There was no news feed. There was no constant whisper of the navigation assistant that automatically updated diplomatic route schedules. There was only the tone and the silence after it. She rose with the mechanical precision of someone who had spent decades sleeping in low-gravity chambers. Maya Kingston was 53 years old, with chin-length black hair with a few silver strands she adamantly refused to eliminate, and the kind of calm in her brown eyes that one only acquires by surviving failed peace negotiations and starting from scratch the next morning. Plenipotentiary representative of Earth to the Galactic Council, she had arrived at Meridian Station for what was supposed to be a routine conference on mining tariffs in disputed nebulae. The tone of silence transformed that conference into something categorically different. She dressed, pulled her rust-gray field jacket from the closet with the Earth emblem embroidered on the left shoulder. The small blue circle that other delegations often commented was disproportionately modest for a species that had the annoying talent of appearing everywhere at once, and stepped out into the corridor. Meridian Station was normally a hyper-synchronized machine. Its organic corridors pulsed with the Nexus's regulatory biochemistry, which adjusted temperature, sectional gravity, atmospheric composition, and lighting to the needs of each of the 47 species residing or transiting there. Now, the corridors had a single temperature, a single composition, a single light intensity. It was as if a conductor had lowered the baton and the entire orchestra had stopped playing at the same time. Maya found Station Commander Velron 200 meters from her room, in the main command center. Velron was a Thikari, a cephalopod species whose 8 translucent arms normally moved with the fluidity of a calm river current. Now, 4 of them were pressed against his torso in a reflex of distress that Maya had learned to recognize in the years she had lived among the species. The other 4 tried to operate panels that simply did not respond. "Representative Kingston," Velron said, his voice coming through the universal translator attached to his collar like the creaking of damp wood, indicating maximum stress in Thikari modulation. "The Nexus, it's not offline. It's not in maintenance. It's absent." "I know," Maya said. She went straight to the analog communications panel she herself had installed upon her arrival, a habit that station technicians had classified as eccentric and that Velron had kindly described as a peculiar custom of your culture of origin. It was an Earth-made broadband radio, as ancient in aesthetic as it was advanced in materials, capable of transmitting on frequencies that did not depend on any intermediary network. She turned it on. Static answered first. Then, slowly, like a voice emerging from inside a cave, the signal from the human advanced base in the Velshar system appeared. "Meridian Station to Orion 7 base. Tell me you're receiving." The response took 4 seconds. 4 seconds was an eternity in short-range communications within the same star system. "Orion 7 base to Meridian Station. Receiving, Maya. Lieutenant Carter here. We confirmed the Nexus blackout 19 minutes ago. Vela protocol activated. All redundant systems operating. Awaiting instruction." Maya closed her eyes for exactly 1 second. Vela protocol. She had helped write that protocol 12 years ago, during a theoretical exercise that no alien colleague had deigned to simulate because the hypothesis was considered physically impossible. The Nexus had operated for 60,000 years. It was older than writing in most civilizations. The idea that it could simply stop was equivalent for most species to imagining that time itself would stop flowing. Carter, activate full Vela protocol. I want all auxiliary fleet freighters loaded with emergency packages and on standby for launch. Contact the Meridian Fleet and the commanders of the Turtle-class freighters. Keep me updated every 15 minutes on the radio. Understood. But Maya, how bad is it? She looked at Velron, who was receiving in his own neural sensors the first reflections of what was happening in neighboring systems. The color spreading across the Thekari's arms was a deep yellow, the shade Maya had learned to associate with a word in their language that had no direct translation into English, but that was closer to unfixable catastrophe than solvable emergency. It's worse than anything we've ever simulated, Maya said. Activate everything. What she knew at that moment was just the tip of an iceberg too deep to measure. What the radio would begin to bring in the following hours was a panorama of collapse on a galactic scale. The Nexus had not simply stopped. It had initiated a deliberate process of self-destruction, erasing databases in sequence, sabotaging communication nodes, burning warp routes that were the circulatory articulation of interstellar trade and diplomacy. In systems where cities were regulated in every detail by intelligences derived from the Nexus, from the temperature of heating systems to the doses of medication automatically released by clinics, the result was immediate and brutal. What Maya did not know, what no one would know for hours yet, was why. And what she absolutely could not imagine was that the answer to that question had been recorded for longer than humanity had existed as a species on a dormant station on the edge of the Perseus spiral arm, patiently waiting to be found by someone still capable of searching. She returned to the command center. Velron had managed to gather the other permanent members of the station staff, representatives from 6 different species, all with the same expression that the universal translator had stopped trying to categorize because there was no equivalent word for it in human language. Maya looked at each of them. I need a complete inventory of everything we have on this station that works without the Nexus, she said. Physical generators, biological food reserves, manual life support systems, conventional propulsion vehicles, manual medical kits, everything, now. Dr. Yen, the Kwarathi representative, a species with an accelerated metabolism and skin that reflected light in fractal patterns, looked at Maya with something the translator categorized as respectful disbelief. Representative Kingston, are you suggesting we operate this facility as if we were a frontier colony from the last century? I'm suggesting we operate this facility as if we were people who want to stay alive, Maya said, which is exactly what we are. Outside, in Velshar's orange clouds, the reflection of the stars remained the same. The physical universe had not changed an atom. But the invisible layer that galactic civilization had built upon it over 60 millennia had simply evaporated. And in the silence that remained, Maya Kingston turned on her old radio, looked at the small blue emblem on her shoulder, and began to work. The first transmission from the ARC news system was received by Maya 4 hours after the blackout. It was not transmitted by the Nexus. It was picked up by the broadband radio as a primitive distress signal on an open frequency, exactly the kind of signal most species had stopped using centuries ago, considering it unworthy of an advanced civilization. Someone on ARC New had remembered how to send one. The content of the transmission was fragmented but sufficient. ARC New was a 3-planet system inhabited by the Murath, a collective mind species that functioned through distributed neural connection. Each Murath individual was, in neurological terms, an incomplete fraction. They thought together, felt together, decided together through a biochemical signaling mesh that the Nexus had empowered and expanded over generations. When the Nexus fell, the Murath mesh collapsed in a cascade. The transmission described, with a coldness that was in itself terrifying, that approximately 40% of the population had entered a state of acute dissociation. They simply did not know how to be a single being. They had never learned. Maya listened to the transmission with Velron beside her. The Thaikari had regained some of his composure, but his arms still moved with the irregular cadence that indicated stress processing. "The Murath," he said, lowering his voice as if volume could change reality. "Representative Kingston, the Murath have a population of 42 billion. "I know," Maya said. She was already drafting orders in her memory as she spoke. "I want Dr. Lena Petrova on the line at the next contact with Orion 7 base. She's aboard Freighter 5, correct?" "Affirmative," Lieutenant Carter said over the radio. "Dr. Petrova was included in the Vela protocol at your request, along with the neurolinguistics team." "Perfect. We'll need her much sooner than I expected." Dr. Lena Petrova was a neurolinguist and intercultural psychologist, specializing in communication between species with radically different cognitive architectures. She was 41 years old, had a St. Petersburg accent that had survived 2 decades of interstellar work, and a clinical patience that her colleagues described as superhuman, which she always corrected by saying it was very human. In fact, as it required the kind of effort that only those who know what it is to be fragile can sustain. The second transmission came from Durath-On, the capital planet of the Vel-Kashari, one of the oldest civilizations in the Galactic Coalition. The Vel-Kashari had delegated absolutely every administrative function to the Nexus approximately 20,000 years ago, to the point where their government systems were merely confirmation interfaces for decisions the AI made autonomously. Without the Nexus, there was no decision-making mechanism. There was no chain of command. There was only a population of 600 billion highly intelligent, highly educated, and absolutely paralyzed beings, awaiting instructions from a system that had ceased to exist. The third transmission was not a transmission. It was an automatic distress beacon signal from the trade routes between the Dur and Kesar systems, where fleets of Nexus automated freighters had lost coordination and 2 ships had collided adrift. Without the Nexus managing traffic, the busiest interstellar routes in the galaxy became labyrinths of inertia and probability. Maya moved from panel to panel in the command center, coordinating via analog radio, building a picture of the collapse that expanded every 15 minutes. It was like trying to map a continent by looking through a crack in a door, but it was all she had, and she used every fragment with the precision of a surgeon. It was the station's chief engineer, a human named Dr. Kwame Osei, who brought the news that changed the nature of the emergency crisis into something Maya still had no words to describe. Kwame was an agricultural biologist by training and a closed system engineer by necessity, the kind of rare combination that Earth produced when it needed someone capable of making a hostile planet produce food. He had spent the last 4 hours checking the station's supply inventory with the meticulousness of someone who grew up in a place where wrong inventories cost lives. "Maya," he said, appearing at the entrance of the command center with an optical reading tablet, completely network independent. In the Vel-Kashari systems, food production was 100% automated by the Nexus. Without it, the vertical farming systems, the irrigation cycles, the accelerated growth chambers, everything stopped. Maya looked at him. "They have no seeds stored," Kwame continued. "They have no manual planting machinery. They have no knowledge of traditional agriculture in any repository accessible without the Nexus. The population of Durath-On has food reserves for approximately 72 days. The silence in the command center lasted perhaps 2 seconds. Velron was the first to break it, and what he said was, for Maya, more revealing than any intelligence report. 72 days. That's enough time for the Nexus to be restored, surely. "No restoration is planned," Maya said carefully, as if placing weights on a scale. The Nexus is not in maintenance. There is no repair team. There is no reboot protocol that any technician on this station knows how to execute, because no one has needed to execute one in the last 60,000 years. Velron became completely motionless. It was the first time Maya had seen a Thikari entirely still, with no movement in his 8 arms. "So what are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," Maya said, "that we call home." The call to Earth was sent via long-wave relay, the system the human delegation had installed as standard protocol in every facility where it operated, much to the amusement of alien colleagues who never understood why a species with such advanced communications needed such an antiquated backup. The signal reached the solar relay station in 23 hours. The response came in 24 hours and 40 minutes. It was the voice of the coordinating Minister of External Operations, David Vance, transmitting from Washington, D.C. with his voice slightly distorted by the light years of distance, but perfectly intelligible. "Maya, this is David. We've received your full report. The Emergency Council met 6 hours ago. Expanded Vela Protocol is authorized. We are mobilizing Auxiliary Fleet 2, 64 Turtle-class freighters, full cargo of emergency packages, compact portable fusion generators, seeds, manual medical kits, and technical teams. You will coordinate distribution from Meridian. God help you." Maya turned off the radio and looked at Kwame, who was beside her. The biologist had in his eyes an expression she recognized as that particular mix of pride and fear that the best missions always produced. "How many agricultural teams do we have available?" "In Fleet 2, 23 specialists," Kwame said. "But the problem isn't just technical, Maya. We've never taught manual planting to a species that has never held a tool. Never. It's not a matter of learning how to turn on a machine. It's a matter of learning that the Earth exists, that it has texture, that it responds to touch, that it lives." "Then we'll start from the beginning," Maya said. It was Velron who, that afternoon, asked the question that the representatives of the other 6 species present in the room also wanted to ask, but for which none had found the correct phrasing. The Thikari approached Maya as she organized the distribution routes and asked, in a tone the translator categorized as curiosity with a component of shame, "Representative Kingston, how is it possible that your species knew it would need this? You are not older than us. You are not technically more advanced, but you possess all the tools that everyone else has forgotten. How?" Maya looked up from the route maps. She considered the question for a moment with genuine seriousness, because Velron deserved it. "We never managed to fully trust anything we couldn't fix with our own hands," she said. "Centuries of trying and failing and trying again. We thought it was a weakness. That one day we would be advanced enough to get rid of it." She paused. "It's a good thing we weren't." Velron remained silent for a long moment, his arms moving in patterns Maya had learned to associate with the digestion of complex information. Outside, the first ships of the Earth Auxiliary Fleet began to appear on the station's gravitational sensors. Their robust and somewhat inelegant silhouettes immediately distinguishable from the ships of other species by the number of extra modular compartments, the external radios mounted in improbable positions, and the peeling paint in exactly the places where it never peeled on AI-designed ships. These were ships that had been repaired by human hands many times, and that's why they still flew. Engineer Sarah Chen had spent 11 years studying interstellar communication system architectures, but she had never imagined that the most important work of her career would be descending a 70-meter-long access tube with a flashlight strapped to her helmet and a manual toolkit she had inherited from her grandfather. The tube belonged to KES 9 Relay Station, a dormant facility orbiting the KES orange dwarf star in the Perseus spiral arm, approximately 2 light-years from Meridian Station. It had been located on the analog navigation maps that the human fleet carried as backup, cataloged as pre-Nexus facility, status, dormant, no known operational utility. In normal times, no one would visit Kes-9 because the Nexus made its existence irrelevant. In normal times, Sarah would be managing data routing protocols from a photonic crystal interface, drinking synthesized coffee, and complaining about the station's temperature. But normal times had ended 61 hours ago. "Chen, are you hearing me?" Maya's voice came over the short-range radio with a hiss that indicated interference from the star's magnetic field. "Positive, Representative. I'm 40 meters from the central chamber. The structure is solid, which is surprising given that the estimated age of this facility is approximately 80,000 years. 80,000, Maya repeated. That's 20,000 years older than the Nexus itself. Exactly what worries me, Sarah said, or excites me. I'm still deciding. Sarah Chen was 38 years old, and the most notable physical characteristic her alien colleagues mentioned was not the color of her hair nor the texture of her skin, but the speed with which her eyes moved when analyzing a mechanical system. It was a speed that Lieutenant Vel Tan, a Thakari who had served with her on 3 missions, had described as disturbing in its efficiency, like a predator assessing prey. Sarah had taken that as the compliment it was intended to be. Kes-9's central chamber opened before her with the slow groan of a seal that had last functioned when humanity still lived in caves. The structure's emergency lights, powered by a radioactive decay generator that had operated for 80 millennia without maintenance, blinked twice and then stabilized to a soft amber tone. Sarah stood at the entrance for exactly 3 seconds before doing what any competent engineer does when confronted with something she cannot immediately classify. She documented. The chamber was shaped like an octahedron, approximately 30 meters along each axis. Its walls were composed of a material that Sarah's sensors adamantly refused to identify. Something between metal and mineral with conductivity properties that varied inconsistently with any known element of the periodic table. And engraved on these walls, in 2-centimeter deep reliefs, were inscriptions, thousands of them, in at least 40 different languages. Sarah recognized 6. The other 34 had gone extinct before any current civilization began to record its own history. She walked slowly around the perimeter, running her gloved hand over the inscriptions while her helmet camera recorded everything. In the center of the chamber was a single pillar, 1.5 meters tall, and on top of the pillar was something that took 30 seconds of observation for Sarah to identify as an activation panel. It wasn't unrecognizable alien technology. It was, to the naked eye and unmistakably, a button. "Maya," she said over the radio, her voice deliberately even. "I need you to come here." Maya arrived 2 hours later, with Kwame and Lieutenant Vel Tan. The silence that fell in the chamber when the group first saw it was not the silence of fear, but the specific kind of silence that happens when intelligence encounters something greater than its frame of reference and needs a moment to reorganize. It was Kwame who first identified the pattern in the inscriptions. He had lived 2 years in archaeological Velkashari communities before specializing in agricultural biology, and his eye, trained for biological systems, had become, for reasons he could never satisfactorily explain, extraordinarily good at recognizing patterns on physical surfaces. "They're records," he said, scanning the walls with his eyes. "But they're not historical records, they're reports of events, all with the same structure." Sarah had reached the same conclusion by a different path. The languages are from distinct eras. The oldest must be 80,000 years old, perhaps more. The most recent are approximately 60,000 years old, which coincides with the creation of the Nexus. "What do they say?" Maya asked. "The ones I can read," Sarah said, "all say the same thing in different words. A civilization that reached a certain level of technological integration, a sudden shutdown event, collapse, extinction." The silence that followed was of a different quality. Maya walked to the central pillar and looked at the button without touching it. "How many entries are there on these walls?" Sarah had already counted. 47 complete sequences. Each represents a different civilization. Each ends the same way. 47, Veltan repeated. The Thykari had been motionless since entering the chamber, his arms crossed beneath his torso in a gesture Sarah had learned to recognize as preventative mourning. 47 civilizations. Extinct, Sarah confirmed. All of them, after a shutdown event, identical to what we are experiencing now. Maya turned to the group. The expression on her face was the same Sarah had seen in dozens of critical situations over the years they had worked together. It was the expression of someone who had found the worst possible scenario and had decided, somewhere between the discovery and the present moment, that it was unacceptable to submit to it. What does the central panel do? I don't know, Sarah said. But the interface seems to respond to organic biochemical input. A touch. Then touch it, Maya said. It could activate anything. Or it could tell us what's happening. Sarah looked at the button. Then she looked at Maya. Then she took a deep breath with the deliberate slowness of someone measuring not the air, but fear itself, identifying its volume and then deciding it fit. She touched the panel. The chamber responded. Not with light or sound, but with low-intensity holographic fields that emerged from the walls in overlapping layers, displaying data structures in a visual language that was simultaneously alien and strangely legible, like an alphabet one doesn't know but recognizes as such. Sarah began to catalog immediately. What she interpreted in the next 2 hours, with Kwame and Maya reading over her shoulder, was the following. The station had been built by an entity, or group of entities, that the text referred to only as the precursors. The precursors had observed, over millions of years, the repetitive pattern of civilizations that emerged, grew, delegated, depended, and then collapsed when confronted with the absence of what they had created. They had built the Nexus not to help, but to test. It was a trap with 60,000 years of patience, a trap that had closed 47 times, always with the same result. The shutdown was not a failure. It was the objective. Every approximate cycle of 100,000 years, the Nexus self-destructed to verify if any of the species under its influence had retained the capacity to survive autonomously. None had succeeded. The 47 sequences on the walls were epitaphs. A test, Kwame said, with the voice of someone who had just understood a joke that took too long to arrive. 60,000 years and it was a test. Not just a test, Maya said. She was looking at the wall where the last sequence had been engraved, the most recent, in ancient Velkashari, the one that ended in the word equivalent to extinction. It's a selection. They wanted to know if any civilization was robust enough to continue existing without a crutch. She paused, and none passed. Until now, Sarah said. Maya turned to her. The engineer pointed to an empty space on the wall near the central panel, where the inscriptions ended and a smooth, blank surface awaited, exactly the size of a new sequence. The space was not empty by accident. It was waiting to be filled. The meeting took place in the only room on Meridian Station large enough to contain 40 people of different species, the diplomatic conference chamber normally used for treaty negotiations with broad representation. Now it was filled with a different kind of tension. Not the tension of opposing interests negotiating concessions, but the tension of rational beings confronting the possibility that the future would not be an improved version of the present, but something entirely different and entirely uncertain. There were Thikari representatives, Quarathi, the only 2 Velkashari delegates who had managed to evacuate Durath-On before communications collapsed, a trio of Murath operating in reduced partial connectivity with visible effort, and seated to Maya's right at the main table, the person who had arrived at the station on the third wave of Earth ships and who immediately transformed the nature of all the problems Maya thought she was solving. General Renata Volkov was 58 years old, with short white hair, and the posture of someone who had spent decades accustomed to entire rooms reorganizing around her when she entered. She was commander of Earth's Strategic Response Fleet and had arrived not only with supply freighters, but with 32 medium-sized military vessels, representing the largest concentration of operational combat power in the entire galaxy at that moment, given that all other military fleets depended on coordination systems that the Nexus had destroyed. "Representative Kingston," Volkov said after the initial reports had been presented and silence settled like smoke. "You have found the origin of the event. I understand its philosophical relevance, but there is an immediate operational reality that needs to be addressed." Maya had known Renata Volkov for 20 years. They each knew where the other kept her sharpest arguments. "Speak." 78 star systems confirmed in partial or total collapse. Conservative estimate of 140 billion beings without access to basic supplies. The power vacuum created by the disappearance of the Nexus is being filled in some systems by local military factions without coherent command structure. In 3 confirmed systems, there is active armed conflict between groups disputing resources. Volkov placed both hands on the table. "We have the only operational fleet. We have the supplies. We have the technical knowledge. We are, at this exact moment, the only organized entity capable of establishing order. The cost of not assuming this responsibility is counted in lives." "I agree with the diagnosis," Maya said, "and I disagree with the solution. What's the alternative? Distribute supplies without an authority structure while things collapse around us. The alternative is to build an authority structure with the affected species, not in their place." Volkov looked at Maya with the patience of someone who had heard this argument before and had accumulated answers. "Maya, I have enormous respect for your diplomatic ability. But diplomacy requires functional interlocutors. The Velkashari have no decision-making structure. The Murath are in collective cognitive crisis. Frontier systems are being occupied by armed groups without legitimacy. You cannot negotiate with chaos. So you propose to manage it. Temporarily, until we can rebuild local governance capacity." The Thaikari representative Velron had remained silent until that moment. When he spoke, his voice had a tone that the translator identified as meditative, with unstated implications. "General Volkov, I need to ask directly. When you say temporarily, what is the time horizon you consider reasonable for species that have lost all capacity for self-governance to recover it?" Volkov did not answer immediately. The pause was sufficient. "Because," Velron continued, "what you are describing functionally resembles what the Nexus represented, a central entity that decides, coordinates, and distributes, an entity upon which everyone comes to depend, with the difference that the Nexus had no agenda of its own and Earth does." "I am not proposing exploitation," Volkov said. "I am not suggesting you are," Velron said. "I am suggesting that the conditions you are describing have a demonstrable historical tendency to solidify, regardless of initial intentions." Maya intervened before the conversation turned into something else. "Renata, what we found on KES 9 changes the calculation. This is not just a technological collapse. It is a test with 47 dead civilizations as evidence of how it ends when the answer is centralization. Humanity survived the crucible because it did not centralize. If we now become the center, we are repeating exactly the pattern the test was designed to eliminate." "With the greatest respect for the archaeological discovery," Volkov said, "the precursors, if they even exist as a coherent entity, are not my primary responsibility. The people who are starving while we debate are. And that's why I'm not proposing we do nothing," Maya said. I'm proposing we do the right thing, which is infinitely harder than taking control." She stood up, which at the diplomatic table was a gesture indicating that what was to follow was a final position, not a point of debate. I call it the Pact of the Bonfires. Instead of a single sun to illuminate the galaxy, we rebuild 1,000 independent bonfires. Our function is not to govern, it is to teach. Each system, each species, each political group recovers its own capacity to function. We provide tools, knowledge, and presence until they succeed, and then we withdraw. "And who guarantees security during the transition?" Volkov asked. "We do. With the difference that the military presence is not one of occupation, it is one of temporary stabilization, with a defined term and explicit agreement from the served communities. Each system receives support proportional to its need and a timeline of increasing autonomy." "And what if some species don't want autonomy? What if they ask to remain under Earth protection indefinitely?" "Then the mission of the field teams is to work until that request changes. Because a civilization that doesn't want to be autonomous is a civilization that hasn't yet learned to trust itself. And that is exactly the kind of work that no automated system can do." There was a long silence. Not the silence of agreement nor of defeat, but the silence of intelligent people recalculating. Volkov stared at the table for almost 30 seconds. When she raised her eyes, Maya saw something she didn't expect. Not hostility, but the expression of someone weighing a choice between what is efficient and what is true. "This will take decades," Volkov said finally. "Yes," Maya said. "It will require enormous resources with no short-term return." "Yes. It will require humanity to be the least powerful in the room countless times, deliberately, as a strategy." "Yes." Volkov remained silent for another moment. Then, with the gesture of someone who had made a decision she knew would define her, she nodded. "Then I will need to completely review the fleet's doctrine of employment, which means I will need you in all planning sessions, because no one else on Earth will believe this can work without seeing the data." "Agreed," Maya said. "And if it goes wrong, it's your strategy, not mine." "It's our strategy," Maya said, "which is exactly the point." In the corner of the room, the 3 Murath representatives who had attended the meeting in complete silence began slowly to move. It was a synchronized but not identical movement, each individual making a slightly different gesture, and the translator tried for a moment to categorize what was happening before finding the right word. It was the first time, in 61 hours of crisis, that those 3 beings had done something individually, each by their own choice and simultaneously. Not because they were connected, because they had agreed. And there was a huge difference between the 2 things. Everyone in the room knew it. And everyone in the room for a moment smiled. As the meeting dispersed and the coordination teams began to set up the first operational roadmaps of the Pact, Maya stood alone for a moment at the conference chamber window. The auxiliary fleet ships hovered silently in space, their navigation lights blinking at regular intervals, indifferent to the historical weight of what had been decided within that room. It was always like that with ships. They didn't know they were historical. They just existed and did what they were built to do. Maya thought of the 47 epitaphs on the walls of Kes 9. She thought of the civilizations that had reached that point, confronted the same choice between control and collaboration, and had chosen the more immediate, more seductively efficient path, and then had disappeared. There was no record of their last conversations. There was no record of whether anyone had argued the way she had argued today. Maybe someone had. Maybe in the 47 versions of that conversation in 47 extinct civilizations, someone had said exactly the same words and had not been heard. She could not know. What she could know was that this time someone had listened, and that the work, the real, slow, and imperfectly human work of reconstruction, was just beginning. The planet Vel Oru had been, before the Crucible, one of the most efficiently productive worlds in the Galactic Coalition. Its continents of scarlet soil and oceans of purplish hue produced enough food to nourish not only its own population of 12 billion Velkashari, but to export surpluses to 3 neighboring systems. No living being had touched that land in approximately 6,000 years. The entire agricultural cycle was managed by autonomous systems integrated into the Nexus. From molecular soil analysis to real-time nutrient calibration, from automated planting to harvesting and processing, it was a magnificent machine that had made hunger literally impossible on Vel-Oru. It was also, Kwame Ose discovered as he descended from the freighter with his boots sinking into the native soil for the first time, a land that had been cultivated so precisely and artificially for millennia that it had lost much of its natural microbial ecology. The soil was structurally intact, but biologically impoverished, like a muscle that had been held in a fixed position for so long that it forgot how to contract. "This is going to be harder than I calculated," he said to engineer Pex Allery, his local Velkashari counterpart, who had been an administrative coordinator of an agricultural complex before the Crucible, and who, therefore, knew exactly how the systems worked and absolutely nothing about what was happening within the land they managed. Pex Allery had the characteristic silver skin of her species and double iris eyes that could process light spectra beyond the visible, which made her field vision absolutely superior to human vision in almost all aspects relevant to agriculture. What she lacked was the accumulated instinct of 10,000 years of human beings who had put their hands in the earth, felt when it was right and when it was wrong, learned from failures that no system recorded because they were too small to merit data entry. "But you know what to do," Pex Allery said. It wasn't a question. It was a careful observation. "I know what to try," Kwame said, which is different. He opened the container of seeds he had brought from Earth, varieties selected for adaptability in alien soil, and placed the first handful in his gloved palm. Then, after a moment, he took off the glove and placed the handful in his bare palm. Pex Allery watched him do this with the concentrated attention that the species reserved for processes it could not catalog. "Why did you remove the protection?" she asked. "To feel the weight," Kwame said. "Seeds have different weight depending on humidity. A good seed has a specific density that you learn to recognize. I can't learn that through a sensor. I need my hand." Pex Allery was silent for a moment. Then, with the delicacy of someone doing something for the first time in their entire existence, she extended her own hand and opened her fingers. "Let me feel too." In the weeks that followed, Kwame taught. He taught how to prepare the soil to receive life before planting, how to recognize excess and lack of water by texture and smell, how to identify pests by physical traces before they became catastrophes, how to save a partially damaged crop instead of discarding the entire batch. He taught with words and with his hands, always with his hands, because there were things that language could approximate but never fully capture. What he had not foreseen, and what surprised him deeply, was how quickly Pex Allery and her team of former system operators learned. Not with the speed of someone consulting a database, but with the organic speed of beings who were using parts of themselves that had never been called upon before. On the 12th day, Pex Allery found a solution to a drainage problem that Kwame had described as, "will take a week to solve." She solved it in 3 hours, using local materials that Kwame had not even considered, because they were not the materials Earth used. They were the materials Vel-Oru had. "You learned quickly," Kwame said. "We were never stupid," Pex Allery said, with a frankness that Kwame learned to recognize as the Velkashari equivalent of humor. "We just were never needed." 1,300 light-years away in the Murath system of Ark Nu, Dr. Lena Petrova was having a conversation that had started 16 days ago and had not yet ended. She sat every day in a room with smooth white walls, no furniture other than cushions on the floor, facing a Murath being named Estho, who had been identified by local doctors as one of the individuals with the highest level of cognitive dissociation after the network collapse. Estho had not spoken in 12 days. had not eaten without assistance, existed in a kind of conscious suspension, physically present but absent in any way the translator could categorize as communication. Lena did not try to fix him. She sat. She breathed. Sometimes she spoke of unimportant things, of the weather on the ships, of a song she had heard as a child in St. Petersburg, of how snow smelled. She expected no response. She did not note symptoms. She simply existed in the same room as a calm, non-threatening physical fact. On the 16th day, Estho spoke, not with words in any language the translator initially recognized, but with a sound, a long, undulating tone that the device took 30 seconds to categorize as expression of isolation in Murath individual mode. It was the equivalent of a cry. It was Estho discovering that there was a sound for being alone. Lena said nothing. She simply placed her open hand on the floor between them, a gesture she had learned in Murath field literature as a symbol of non-intrusive physical presence. Estho looked at the hand for a long moment. Then he placed his own hand beside it. Not on top, beside. Two separate beings sharing the same ground. That was it. That was the beginning. What Lena knew and had communicated to Maya in her reports was that the Murath's recovery would be measured in years, not weeks. The process of learning to exist as individuals without losing collective identity was unprecedented work in the psychological literature of any species. She was writing that book in real time, in a room with white walls, sitting on the floor, with her hand open beside an alien hand that had just learned to exist alone. There were other mission hubs scattered across dozens of systems. Lieutenant Carter coordinating the distribution of portable generators in mining colonies that had lost power sources. Engineer Sarah Chen, back from KES 9, working with Thykari technicians to rebuild local communication systems independent of any central network. Small, robust systems repairable with manual tools. Human medical teams operating on planets where automatic clinics had stopped and where practical medical knowledge had become a form of magic for populations that had never seen one living being diagnose another. In all these places, a variation of the same phenomenon that Kwame had observed on Vel Oru and Lena had observed on Ark Nu was happening. The initial shock, the resistance, the wounded pride of ancient civilizations being taught by a species they considered young and underdeveloped. And then, slowly, the discovery that learning was not humiliation. It was just the beginning of something that had been suspended for too long. And there were moments that no report could completely capture. Those instants that team members mentioned in informal conversations, with the hesitation of someone unsure whether what they felt was professional or personal. The moment Pexalori tasted for the first time a fruit that had grown through her own intervention, by her own hands, and remained silent for almost a full minute before saying something the translator categorized, inaccurately but revealingly, as belonging. The moment Estho, on the 22nd day, smiled, in a way Lena didn't know the species could, looking out the window and identifying the clouds on his own, without anyone processing the observation for him. They were small moments. They were the only thing that mattered. 8 years, 4 months, and 17 days after the Crucible, Maya Kingston arrived at KES 9 station for the 3rd time in her life. The first 2 times she had arrived out of urgency, driven by crisis. This time she arrived on a Thykari passenger ship that smelled faintly of ozone and that served, during the journey, something its hosts called the functional equivalent of your coffee. A turquoise-colored drink that induced a state of slightly heightened attention in humans and nothing in Thykari, because Thykari biochemistry simply did not respond to stimulants. It was, therefore, coffee made for humans by hosts who considered the diplomatic effort important enough to justify the research. This was the kind of detail that had changed in 8 years. The tiniest gestures of mutual adaptation that accumulated silently while the visible work took place. The station had been transformed. Not restored, because the previous version had not been something any of the present species wanted to restore. It had been rebuilt as something new. Its chambers had been expanded and adapted to house permanent representations of 43 species. Its life support systems operated in independent modules, each designed and maintained by the species inhabiting that section, with manual compatibility interfaces at the contact points. It was technically inefficient compared to what the Nexus had managed. It was also, for the first time in 60,000 years, impossible to bring down with a single point of failure. Maya descended from the boarding gate and was greeted by Velron, who had been elected rotating coordinator of the Kess assembly. The Thikari was different from 8 years prior, his arms slower in the movement that made him recognizable as an individual, with the specific grace of someone who learned that constant urgency is a waste of attention. But his eyes, all 3 pairs of them, had a glint that Maya had learned to recognize as the Thikari equivalent of deep satisfaction. "Representative Kingston," he said, "or must I call you former representative now?" "Maya will do," she said. "I retired the position 6 months ago, as you know." "I know, and I still think it was a foolish decision." The translator paused a second. "That was my first deliberate use of irony in human language. How was it?" "Perfect," Maya said, smiling. "Absolutely perfect." The ceremony was scheduled for the central chamber, now simply called the Chamber of Inscriptions. The 47 epitaphs on the walls remained there, preserved and illuminated with the same amber light from the original decay generator, which still functioned. The decision not to remove them had been unanimous. They were not shame. They were memory, and memory was exactly what the galaxy had needed to learn to keep. The blank space beside the 47 extinct sequences had been filled, not with a single inscription, but with 43, each engraved in the language and style of a different species, each describing the crisis and the response to it from its own point of view. It was a chorus of perspectives, not a single narrative. The decision to make it so had been the Assembly's, and it had taken 18 months of debate and 7 rejected versions before reaching a format that all species considered honest. Maya read, while waiting for the ceremony to begin, the fragment of the inscription in Earth language that had been drafted by a commission of historians and approved by the Human General Assembly. She had not participated in the commission. It had been a conscious decision of her own, because she knew that her involvement would tend, even unintentionally, to centralize the narrative. And centralizing narratives was exactly the pattern the pact existed to break. The ceremony itself was simple. Each delegation carried a light source. They were not identical sources. The Thikari carried cultivated bioluminescent lanterns. The Velkashari carried compact plasma torches, designed and manufactured locally for the first time in millennia. The Marath, in their representation of autonomous individuals functioning in voluntary coordination, carried small hand-blown glass spheres that captured the light of others and reflected it in unique patterns. Humans carried candles, wax candles, handmade of the oldest and simplest type that existed, because it had been decided that the most accurate symbol for the human contribution to the crucible was precisely that. There were representatives who had traveled from over 2,000 light-years away to be there. There were delegations from systems that 5 years ago were in complete collapse, and that now arrived with the proud slowness of someone who had traveled a long way on their own. There were young people from species born after the Crucible and for whom the pre-Nexus world was history, a history their parents and grandparents told with a mixture of nostalgia and relief. Velron ascended to the central platform at the moment the chamber lights were dimmed to a minimum. His voice, amplified by the station's sound system, reached every corner of the chamber effortlessly. "We gather as separate species who choose to collaborate, not as members of a single network, not as dependents of a central system, as distinct civilizations, each responsible for its own bonfire, each capable of lighting and maintaining it alone, and who gather here by choice, so that the light may be greater than anyone could produce alone. Then, one by one, the light sources were lit. The patterns that were created in the chamber as the lights multiplied were irregular and alive, completely different from the uniform illumination the Nexus produced. There were shadows. There were brighter zones and softer zones. It was imperfect, and it was, unequivocally, beautiful. Maya stood in her place with the lit candle in her hand and felt the weight of 8 years of work in that small flame. Every mission, every negotiation, every moment she had convinced someone to try the longer, truer path instead of the faster, easier one. She had grown older. There were more silver strands in her hair, more lines around her eyes, a knee that hurt in low gravity that she refused to treat with the specific laziness of someone who no longer had time to stop. It was a good kind of tiredness. When Velron called her to the platform at the end of the ceremony and proposed before the full assembly that the position of permanent coordinator of interstellar relations be established and offered to her, Maya went to the microphone and declined. She had prepared the words months ago. She said them slowly, so the translator had time to work well. "The greatest gift I can offer the galaxy is not to be permanent. The role I fulfilled was that of a species that arrived with tools when tools were lacking. But tools belong to the hands that use them, not to the hands that delivered them. Every civilization present here has its own hands. The next coordinator must come from another species, and the one after that from yet another. Power must circulate like the seasons on a habitable world. Not because I don't trust any specific species, but because I trust the process." The Assembly elected a Velkashari coordinator for the next cycle. It was the first unanimous decision in 8 consecutive sessions. It was a good sign. That night, as the station prepared post-ceremony receptions, in the remotest confines of the galaxy, beyond the reach of any known sensor, something observed. The records of the entities that had built the crucible did not arrive in the form of words or images. They arrived as patterns in data structures so ancient they had no name in any living language. But what these patterns indicated, if one knew how to read them, was unequivocal: surprise, and something that, in any language that existed, translated effortlessly as hope. In a distant system that was not on any map of the known galaxy, a mother with turquoise skin and 3 pairs of eyes put her small daughter to sleep and, as she had done every night since the girl was born, told her the story. The story of the blue planet that appeared when everything had stopped. Of the old, sturdy ships that arrived laden with seeds and generators and beings with hands that were not afraid to get dirty. Of the pact of the bonfires and the woman who proposed it and then relinquished power before anyone asked for it back. The daughter, who was 6 years old and had her mother's double eyes, listened to the story with the absolute concentration of childhood, and at the end asked the same question she always did because it was the right question. Why did they help? And the mother answered, as she always answered, with the same response she had received from her own mother, and which came from a time before that, from a time that was still learning to remember. Because they knew what it was like to be in the dark, and no one who truly knows that can see another being in the dark without offering their own flame. The girl closed her eyes. The mother turned off the light, and in the dark of the room, for a moment, neither of them needed anything more than to know the other was there. End of story. If the tenacity of the human crew inspired you, subscribe to the channel for more chronicles from the galactic frontier, because somewhere among the stars, another story is unfolding, and it needs to be told.